Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on sociology in India. Today we are going to discuss the concept of civil society, especially the impact of civil society within India. This module has been written by Ms. Kanika Sood, Research Scholar, Department of Sociology, University of Mumbai. In this module, we are going to discuss on the theories of civil society and also discuss whether the concept of civil society as has been developed within the Western theoretical context can be applied to the Indian context. Further, we will also discuss the challenge of civil society in order to address the concerns of marginalized in India. And last but not the least, whether the opening up of new domains such as the internet has created spaces for civil society interventions in India. Introduction. In the following module titled Intervention and Impact of Civil Society in India, the author aims to explicate the notion of civil society by referring to various scholars who have theorized the term. In an attempt to further explain the concept of civil society, the section is followed by looking at how civil society is understood in contemporary times to understand the ongoing paradigm that the current understanding rests on. Some commonalities are drawn from the Habermasian notion of public sphere. As previously mentioned, the concept and term civil society is a Western concept. It has evolved within the Western political philosophy. So, the succeeding session would give a bird's view of the application of this term in the Indian context, after which a small section is dedicated towards delineating the historical roots of civil society in India and what constitutes membership in Indian civil societies given their hierarchical and divisive nature. Towards the end of the module, the author endeavors to give a brief overview of the debates around the digitalized era that the Indian civil societies are a part of. Given the digitally mediated lives we lead, it still needs to be seen whether civil societies benefit from such an arrangement, or is it all noise and no activism but only slacktivism. Civil society as a concept has numerous theories allocated to itself. Nonetheless, there is no consensus among theorists about its meaning as yet. Urry and McWane state that civil society generally inhabits the space between the state and the household. The use of the term civil society is not limited solely to academic circles. These definitions of the term found in two popular dictionaries mentioned subsequently allude us to the popularity of the term used in common parlance. According to dictionary.com's 21st century lexicon, civil society is defined as a. The aggregate of non-governmental organizations and institutions that manifest interest and the will of the citizens, or b. Individuals and organizations in a society which are independent of the government. Occasionally, the notion of civil society is applied to the more usual sense, the elements such as freedom of speech and independent judiciary that make up a democratic society. However, the meanings and interpretations of what constitutes a civil society have been subject to change over a period of time and are open to contestation. In the following section, readers will be acquainted with how the concept of civil society came to be theorized until now. From this supplementary reading, students will learn to examine how the concept of civil society developed in the Western tradition of political thought, the questions around the applicability of the concept of civil society in India. Woman has laid out the three phases, incarnations in enabling us to understand the notion of civil society and how it came into being. The following section will begin by setting out woman's articulation of the three incarnations of the civil society, followed by several other scholars. Theorization of civil society. In the first incarnation, civil society was distinguished from primitive societies by many anthropologists such as Richard Putnam in 1589. 75 years later, Hobbes published Leviathan, which was regarded as a political counterpart to Putnam's anthropological discourse. A century after that, Adam Ferguson, the father of modern sociology, wrote an essay on the history of civil society. This text contested that Europe had already attained civil society, the loftiest position in the assumed hierarchy of societies. Thus, one can observe civil society is a space which has occupied a premier position among the multiplicity of societies. In the second incarnation of civil society, two intellectual lineages were acknowledged. Works of Hegel and Karl Marx, works of Antonio Gramsci and Franco Scottish, with Tocqueville as a central figure. While it is difficult to see homogeneity in their conceptualization within these lineages, one cannot deny that the parallels between them are substantial. Hegel wanted civil society to be subordinated to the state. He placed universal altruism of the state adjacent with the universal egoism of civil society. Marx, on the contrary, wanted the state to be able to subordinate to the civil society. According to him, state could turn repressive, oppressive and despotic, and civil society a space for crass materialism and contestation. The predicament with the Marxian conceptualization Ullmann articulates lies with the disproportionate anticipation that the state will shrivel away. Gramsci's theorization of civil society surpasses economic context. According to him, civil society is located in the superstructural sphere and not the structural. When the civil society is located in the state, it is stripped of its legal specificity and autonomy, not to mention its real purpose vis-a-vis the state, that of functioning as a power which counterbalances the hegemonic forces at play. Tocqueville too places the state side by side with civil society, the latter being rooted in private interest and economic activity. Ullmann shows how the specificity of the two lineages has been somewhat lost. What was assigned as civil society by Marx, a space for crass materialism, and Tocqueville, rooted in private interest and economic activity, are actually market forces. It is at this juncture that lies the advantage of viewing what Tocqueville labels political society as civil society. According to Tocqueville, civil society is supposed to protect the individual from the state. However, he further claims that if the state is democratic, we wouldn't then need a civil society. He raised a policy of counter-hegemonic forces in the society that topple the dominant class. In contrast to him, Gramsci claims that civil society protects the state. This would mean that in a good society, the two would merge. Thus, from the former's view, civil society is anti-state, while from the latter's view, civil society is pro-state. To both, it plays a democratic role. However, there is confusion in terms of the space and quality. As a result, Ullmann poses that civil society has to be understood as space between the state and the market. Just as the state can either be democratic or totalitarian, a civil society too, according to Ullmann, may have contradictory and differing orientations or may contain such segments in it. Associational versus regime. These dimensions have been brought into contemporary discussions of civil society as well. Civil society is therefore seen as this pluralistic space by which associations operate as bells which transmit between the individual and the civil society. The associational school, O'Donnell and Schmitter, Bratton and Van de Waal, and regime school, Diamond, both understand civil society in this way. The former is largely inspired by Tocqueville. It prescribed keeping a check on the state by calculating and thoroughly examining its processes and operations. The aim here is to instill a sense of political participation and tolerance in the population. The latter, stirred by Locke, is less pluralistic. Here, civil society and an active associational life do not on its own lead to improved governance. Therefore, they prescribe the need for state reform. Alterations of the state society to further democratization are seen as a need of the hour. The neoliberal school, on the other hand, views civil society as a space for private property rights. Thus, the good governance initiatives are aimed at establishing market-friendly political institutions. The solutions Giles posits is some form of social movement-based alternative, but the conditions in which these might become significant are poorly addressed. As documented by Allen, the donor discourses on civil society are informed by associational school to a very large extent in comparison to the regime school. Giles maps out key argument of the donors. The general discourses are threefold. Civil society is in conflict with the state. He quotes from Keynes' work on Europe and totalitarianism, which mentions that civil society confronts the state and is comprised of associations whose interests are primarily non-economic. The civil society in this sense then opposes the infringement and violation of a tyrannical state. Haydn gives an analogy of a balloon suspended above society to be described as a state, thus signifying that the two are not linked, and the need to promote re-engagement between the state and civil society in the form of civil society strengthening and citizenship building. Civil society is at the spirit of democratization struggle. It is a medium through which public opinion in favor of justice is channeled into policy making in a collaborative manner. At the same time, augmenting people's confidence and interest in getting concerned with public affairs as well as establishing their institutional capacity to do so. NGOs form a highly significant part of civil society. According to McWane, NGOs are vehicles or agents in civil society, thus come between the state and the citizen. State is thus relieved of his welfare position, argues Giles. NGOs are thus perceived as more resourceful than the fraudulent and corrupt states. If looked at it in terms of economics, there is freedom to mobilize resources. Drawing from Verma, one can note that there are several scholars have recognized that although definition of civil society might be subject to numerous interpretations in the Western traditions, it arose mainly from the idea of a limited state and as an area of resistance to the state. Civil society a space for the marginalized. Thus, as one can observe in the face of several theories of civil society, the ongoing paradigm rests on specific vision wherein civil society is treated as an autonomous realm of associational life, in which interest can be pursued collectively. The relationship between civil society theory and discourse is then closely tied with democratic theory and discourse. According to Shah, civil society is a space which is used to protect the interest and rights of the marginalized group. He further mentions this to be a political issue. Civil society, then, is viewed to have number of crucial functions in development and democratization which they endeavor to support. For instance, Joseph argues in depth about various non-political outfits that were occupied with introducing Maharashtra's employment guarantee scheme. These organizations apprehended EGS potential to deal with myriad issues concerning the marginalized sections of the society such as women, Dalits, tribal, landless and so on. Joseph has analyzed how these groups engaged with the state in defining the scope and reach of EGS and how the definition was enlarged by the same group to empower the poor. It is therefore a space concerned with the common good as a space for deliberation and activities related to common good in the outer orbit of the state. In an hierarchical society wherein various segments of population have embroiled in real or imaginary conflicts, civil society provides a space for the members and agents to contest for sectional and collective interest, argues Shah. It is a space where discourse on various facets of common good are discussed, which offers an opportunity for persuasion to conflicting views. One is reminded of the Habermasian notion of public sphere articulated by Habermas in one of his influential texts, an important contribution to modern understanding of democracy, titled The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, an Inquiry into a Category of Bourgeois Society, published in 1962. Habermas had emphasized that the idea of public is related to the notion of the common. According to Hanna, the public sphere is thus the common world that gathers us together and yet prevents our falling over each other. Habermas thus articulated that the public space is a society engaged in critical public debate. He laid out the conditions of public sphere as discussed in his work: the formation of public opinion, all citizens having access, conference in unrestricted fashion. This is based on the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, of expression, publication of opinions about matters of general interest, which implies freedom from economic and political control. And finally, debate over general rules governing relations. Thus, in order then for civil society activism to evolve, it is important that an arena can be established wherein voices can be raised, heard and exchanged with society and government. The question of civil society is therefore linked to conditions, contours, limitations and possibilities of communication, media and public sphere. However, various scholars have pointed out some differences along with the similarities in the sociological perspectives between the two terms. Civil society, a Western concept in the Indian context. Civil society thus, on one hand, from the way it has been evolved and interpreted, can be seen as a vast and fluid space whose boundaries cannot be delineated differently. Reason being the strength of multiplicity arguments which form a civil society change from time to time and from issue to issue. On the other hand, several scholars view civil society from a different lens. Chatterjee affirms that civil society comes into view as a close alliance of modern elite groups isolated from the wider population life of the communities, walled up within the enclaves of civil freedom and rational law. According to Berglund, theories on civil society have been unsuccessful in making an impact on general democratization theory. Berglund further articulates that the term civil society has been overlapped with strong predominance of liberal social theory and with the consolidation of a neoliberal regime within politics and economics. The debate on civil society, Berglund argues, has misplaced its momentum. In return, however, the notion is now a significant part of dominating development models which are premeditated by the World Bank and IMF. Through the concept of good governance, the World Bank forces its debtors and member countries to promote the role of civil society as a catalyst of of both democracy and market economy. The critics of notion of civil society dispute that as a concept civil society is rooted in Western bias and that it has little or no global relevance. Palshikar and Mahajan have problematized this tendency to directly espouse a Western-centric participation-based conception of associative democracy. They assert that this espousal has direct repercussions in Indian context. India is deeply rooted in hierarchical power relations which have not yet been broken down. Quite the contrary, they have been reinforced and re-established politically. In this context, emphasis on direct participation will let inequalities and structures of domination remain intact. Chatterjee and Mahajan have explicitly argued against sharing with our Western counterparts the notion of civil society as something opposed to the state. Chatterjee is critical of the notion of civil society. In one of his works, Chatterjee defines civil society as a closed association of modern elite groups walled up within enclaves of civil freedom, civic freedom and rational law. Civil society then is confined to a unique Western European experience. Thus, a participatory civil society without the intervention of the state in the Indian context, they argue, will have consequences. In opposition, Mahajan supports for an older Western idea of the state where the guarantor of individual rights. Zaidi reiterates that direct importation of the term civil society in the southern countries become more complicated. The presence of the indigenous belief system, organization and politics in such countries give the Western meaning of the term a very different angle. Kishwar is skeptical about civil society involvement in India as she asserts that they draw financial assistance from Western agencies and tune into their political and social economic agendas. She prefers that a genuine civil society organization should draw from the social groups it claims to represent, as they should owe some accountability to that particular group. However, in the work titled Civil Society and Democracy, Eliot states that relationship between civil society and democracy is intrinsically political, undividable from the nature of the state and the political forces arising from the society. Contrary to the scholars who view civil society as only a Western concept, she opines that civil societies differ according to the politics of each region. Nevertheless, the expansion of democratic governments based on civil society depends on the array of values, organizations and political institutions. Thus, the rise of civil society does not necessarily give rise to democracy. Verma articulates that civil society rests on entirely different social forces, on market forces in East Europe, new social movements in Western Europe and Islamic countries in Southeast Asia. Usefulness of civil society in India. In the last 3 decades or so, India has witnessed civil society organizations becoming an integral part of policy and law-making processes. Every legislation which has been involved in education, women's rights, environmental rights and forest rights, employee and workers' rights, welfare rights for the poor and so forth, has stemmed from the civil society organizations. They are also very critical of liberalization and corporate forces and are enablers of slowing down the impact of these forces towards the marginalized. The influential Ganga River Basin Authority, headed by the Prime Minister, has a good representation of civil society organizations. Well-endowed organizations have supported the RTI movement, that is Right to Information movement, which has gained a lot of momentum. Are too many examples one can think of when it comes to work from civil society organizations in India. In fact, the term civil society in India covers such a wide range of factors, processes and identities that some doubt its usefulness. According to Chandoke, the term civil society has lost both shape and content as it is on everyone's lips with a fair amount of readiness. The organizations which inhabit this space range from people's movement which have not registered with the government to research institutions to local NGOs, all allegedly to fall under the same grouping despite their very different operational modes. Tandon and Mahanti in their work Does Civil Society Matter? Governance in Contemporary India have spelled out a few case studies substantiating the positive impact of civil society on governance. The chapters on saving the Chilka movement, Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, land distribution for coal tribes are particular case studies discussed, while chapters on Dalit movements and subaltern movements are more general in nature. The case studies, according to Sultanat, grant some of the patterns to shape a role for civil society in the governance processes. The point to be emphasized is that these patterns are different and not pertinent in all places in an identical manner. For instance, in some cases like the coal tribals of UP, persuading influential persons from the larger civil society to express their solidarity with the cause of the tribals, this was a useful part of the movement, while solidarity and association of various social movements with a larger front was decisive in the cause of Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha. The chapter by Sudha Pai and Ram Narayan on the part played by Dalit protest and its impact on democratic governance and civil society gives an exemplification of the inductive approach. Caste is one of the single most determining factors which manipulate civil society and the democratic purposes in contrast to the Western societies. Therefore, it becomes pertinent to democratize the domains which are deeply rooted in the hierarchies and in egalitarian power relations for effective governance. Indian civil society historical roots. Berglund has highlighted some differences in the recent development of the state in both the West and in third world countries like India. In the West, the modern state developed concurrently with the civil society. With passing centuries, both became stronger and efficient. In India and other third world countries, pre-colonial power did not enjoy absolute power as the West did. Religious and traditional power structures were outside its immediate reach. The formation of civil society was therefore affected by these alternative power structures. In the Indian context, this led to a sturdy position of native religions elites as well as amplification of religious identity in both private and in both private spaces and in civil societies. Thus, popular mobilization was apparent already in the colonial period, but the formation of both state and civil society in India has been different from what it has been in Western Europe. Quite a few reform movements became mushrooming throughout the 19th century, such as Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Ramakrishna Mission, Theosophical Society and so on. All these reform movements had similar features in that they strongly advocated for a unification of all Hindus, in addition to playing a central part in the freedom movement while strengthening the Indian civil society. The national resistance led by Indian National Congress became the key foundation of civil society in the 20th century India. While the struggles harbored by the Indian National Congress were basically anti-colonial, in itself it held many activities which would later on continue as independent sections of civil society, like the women's movement. While Indian National Congress gained momentum, other forms of social movements expanded in force during the first half of the 20th century. There was, for instance, an increased understanding among Indian workers which led them to build up a sphere out of the immediate influence of both the state and capital owners. All Indian Trade Union Congress was thus formed, which played a role in shaping civil society even during the late colonial period. Even though there were efforts to take apart the colonial state, its pattern very much dominated the scenario after independence. For quite a few decades, central planning focused on state action and not civil society. There were massive protests which took place challenging the Indira Gandhi-led government. As a consequence, the Prime Minister declared a state of emergency in 1975, which remained for the next 2 years. Even as this was brutal curbing of civil and political rights, the civil society was vitalized and one could view an escalation in the new activities within both traditional social movements and new social movements. These groups openly defied the state on the local, regional and national levels. New groups began to vigorously assert their rights and fight in opposition to the apparent inequalities and oppression being meted out to them. State development as a project was being questioned. From the 1980s onward, NGOs were expected to take responsibility for social development. It can therefore be noted that fractional malfunction of the state to address the social and economic needs has changed the quality and character of civil society. In a way, groups and individuals have been roused to engage in civil society in India, but the development of civil society has been stalled by the lack of ability to offer basic education and other forms of social services. Also, our Indian society is characterized by blaring inequalities based on caste, class, religion, gender and other such grounds. So, the civil society too is then permeated by an assortment of conflicts. What qualifies for membership in civil society in India? Numerous debates have been raised about the type of organization that qualify for membership in civil society. According to the liberal political definition, associations which are internally democratic and open to all citizens, which have goals and activities in line with the core democratic values, which work for the greater common good, are seen as good enough criteria for membership. Only those associations which affirm openness of entry and exist and which stand by the universalist criteria of citizenship should be considered as part of civil society. As such, any association which excludes persons on the basis of ethnicity, class or religious persuasion is clearly not a part of the civil society, argues Jayal. However, some associations exclude members because they have a narrow agenda. Berglund cites an example of trade unions working together for better wages for the members to highlight that trade unions do not work for the greater common good. So should associations like these be included in defining what a civil society is? The issue with sticking to strict definitions which limit the criteria for membership is that one runs a risk of keeping out many important associations of civil society. This risk is even higher in a country like India, which is deeply rooted in all sorts of inequalities based on gender, class, caste, religion, region and so on. So while associations in India may not match up to the liberal political definition, they may nonetheless play a decisive role in challenging the oppressive state. In his work, Berglund has adopted a definition of civil society which is more open than the version espoused by liberal politics. Under this definition, lack of openness, pluralism, etc. may be deemed as a part of civil society. This includes associations formed on the basis of elemental identities such as religion, class, caste, gender and so on. However, as the state enjoys all the political power, these associations may put pressure on it, and in the process that demand may challenge other sections of the civil society. For example, the demand for group rights based on religion, gender, caste may conflict with the interest of other groups, thus turning civil society into a combat field instead of a sheltered and isolated domain of peaceful interaction. Hence, power structures and forms of domination are identified along with the recognition of importance of interaction with civil society. A more realistic view would be then to characterize civil society in India as a public arena wherein multiple interests meet, compete, challenge the state and also have conflicts with other groups within the civil society. One therefore cannot deny this arena is affected by power relations in societies at large, regenerating myriad inequalities. Internet and civil society. Over the past 2 decades, Internet has become a potent medium for individuals and groups to engage with numerous issues such as political participation, public policies, expression of solidarity with the politics of marginalized communities. One can also witness rise and spread of NGO and other civil society actors, which is very attributable to the emergence and rapid spread of Internet. It can also be noted how search technologies like Google, AskMe.com, CoolSocialSearch.com, tools like blogs, communicative systems like Skype, Google Hangout, etc. make it easier to form virtual communities where like-minded people can form connections. With widespread access to inexpensive technological devices and network connections, one can see the proliferation of the phenomenon of people advocating causes of all shapes and sizes. The rise of Internet age has not been met without consequences for non-democratic and authoritarian states. The protest against President Mubarak's regime in Egypt comes to mind as an example of such an occurrence. The masses that took to streets to protest used internet and mobile phone technologies to synchronize the protest. People from all over the world watched the events through Al Jazeera satellite TV channel as the Egyptian authorities first switched off the internet. However, the internet in itself is not a democratic space which a democratic civil society can inhabit. There have been various instances of a wide variety of resistance networks, military groups and criminal organizations which use it for their own malevolent purposes. Nonetheless, one can see that progressive and social justice groups have made use of the internet to promote various pro-justice causes. The internet can then be seen as a facilitating force which enables civil society activities by offering new possibilities for citizen participation. Hoffman takes a case of the socialist state in Cuba in order to look at civil society dynamics and compare the pre-internet era in Cuba with web-based media introduced communication in Cuba post-90s. According to this study in the former era, the focus was largely on behind-the-scenes struggles for associational autonomy within the state socialist framework, but now web-based communication technologies have sustained the emergence of a new type of public sphere in which civil society debate is marked by autonomous citizen action. However, the internet's impact on the public sphere and on civil society dynamics in a non-pluralistic context like Cuba depends on the point at which a web-based voice links with offline public debate and social action. Digital age, new opportunities for strengthening civil society. As mentioned previously, internet impacts authoritarian regimes in numerous ways. The control of authoritative regimes is limited to the territorial boundaries of the nation state in which it exercises power. Traditional media is too bound to the nation state. The internet, however, has an inherently transborder character which defies the conventional filters to access and patterns of regulation in any state. This signifies a political challenge to the state. Within very little time, social actors use digital and web-based media to claim public space, citizen rights, raise voices and advocate various pro-justice causes. There are different ways in which individuals and groups have come to use digital and web-based media, such as use of email communication, blogs, digital recordings and so on. Blogs have experienced a wide-reaching boom. Reason being, they are seeing writing blogs as an opportunity to author their own write-up, share it with all and sundry without going going through a rigorous process of editing, and neither do blogs require huge technological and financial resources. They are also more or less have the ability to pass through censorship filters exposed by the state. It has also paved the way for bloggers to reflect and write about things that were not shown in the mainstream media outlets. Thus, the very fact of using this media, bloggers and internet users are by and large advocating a right to partake in public sphere individually and outside the state monopoly or mass media. This in turn becomes a civic action in itself, wherein internet users are politically assertive. However, the internet is not exactly a space devoid of state regulation, especially in an authoritarian context. Giving Cuba's example, Hoffman has written that the state's reaction to independent bloggers has not been very encouraging. He briefly talks about Sanchez's blog and its international reach, followed by getting an award for digital journalism. She was denied permission by the state to leave Cuba to deliver talks and speeches. Her husband was threatened to be dismissed from work. Nonetheless, despite tight state regulations, the internet activists still benefit from the prevalence of the digitalized society we inhabit. In this highly networked society, one can observe the emergence of self-assertive netizens which demand a widening of public sphere and a larger degree of citizen autonomy from the state. Thus, in itself, it leads to different kind of civil society. Thus, as one can see, technologies and shifts in communication they enable have the potential to significantly increase at least some parts of public sphere. Opportunities. Is civil society? Don't think so. It can therefore cannot be denied that new technologies lower the cost and increase the speed, thus enabling a level of access to knowledge, opinions and ideas that never existed before, on one major condition that the people have access to internet. The skeptics are however not very thrilled with the promises and the rosy picture upheld by the cyber enthusiasts. The skeptics do not deny that they value the horizontal organizing and communication with little need for bureaucratic vertical forms of non-profits, political parties, newspapers, labor unions and all. Neither do they deny that fluid and vibrant expressions of civic interaction spawning more exchanges and debates is more desirable, and in doing so amplifying the civil society in the process. What they question is the validity of all these claims and many more made by cyber enthusiasts. Thinkers in this camp do not doubt the importance of social media in enabling civic interaction, nor do they dispute that internet enables us to exchange ideas and information faster. What they do contend is the claim that these developments are unmistakably positive in their outcome. They refuse to believe that there is anything inevitable about them, at the same time viewing politics and human agency as more strong influences of the future than technology. The strengths perceived by virtual enthusiasts of these spaces are then seen as weaknesses, all depending on who gets access and how they use it, and if they are complemented by face-to-face engagement and other traditional modes of civil society activity. Digital skeptics hence see online activism and virtual interactions as not always of resistance. They accuse the ongoing trend as clicktivism, slacktivism, and superficiality. Although they do not deny that all civil society organizations use digital tools to organize and communicate their messages, they firmly have an opinion that no social movements are likely to generate on digital spaces. However, given the highly digitally mediated lives we lead in this network society, being skeptical of technology or changes it brings within it, the civil society organizations in India might really not help. In fact, one needs to be open to the changes brought forward and also mindful of how they can be used in favorable ways in reaching the goals of the civil society. From this module, while wrapping up, one could say that civil society plays a crucial role with regard to aiding India's government in tackling poverty and marginalization, and especially other issues that are plaguing the various societies in India. Since it is a Western concept, its application and its relevance in the Indian context has to be analyzed while paying careful attention to the Indian context. Thank you.